welcome to A Year of Hitchcock Movies. We're your hosts, Jeff and Diane, and this is movie number 46 from 1969, Topaz. And, well, the pressure is mounting for Alfred Hitchcock. He's had a couple of movies in a row that were box office failures. Last week's Torn Curtain and the movie before that, Marnie. Torn Curtain made some money. It was okay at the box office, but it was very, very expensive to make. So it ended up losing a lot of money for the studio, for Universal Pictures, and so they end up wanting, again, coming in and wanting him to do a project that they thought would succeed, and they wanted him to do a film of the best-selling novel from 1967 called Topaz, written by Leon Uris, and he agrees. He's interested in the project. It's another Cold War spy thriller. Sort of one of these realistic things like what we saw in Torn Curtain. And this time, Universal doesn't force expensive actors on Alfred Hitchcock. What we saw last week with Torn Curtain with Paul Newman and Julie Andrews, and that didn't turn out real well. But they do force the author on him, Leon Uris, as the screenwriter, and that didn't work out well. He's a novelist, he's not a screenwriter, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But first, a little background on the novel Topaz from 1967. It's set during the real-life Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and if you have time and you're unfamiliar with the Cuban Missile Crisis, just take a look at it on Wikipedia and read up on it. And Topaz itself was based on a real-life event called the Sapphire Affair. Sapphire, Topaz, where in 1962, apparently, then President John F. Kennedy wrote a secret memo to the President of France, Charles de Gaulle, informing him that there were Soviet spies had infiltrated the French government at the highest level. And the spies were called Sapphire, or the spy ring was called Sapphire, or something. And the book was changed to the title was Topaz, but the Cuban connection is that the Soviets were putting missiles on bases in Cuba aimed at the United States, and like we were finding with last week's Torn Curtain, we're pretty scared of Soviets in those days, and the threat of nuclear war was alive and well, and the Cold War was raging. So part of this realism is actually in the movie. You see footage of the Russian army, the Soviet army, parading in Red Square in Moscow. You see their nuclear weapons. And they actually, in this movie, they splice in real live footage of Fidel Castro and a little bit of Che Guevara. They're not speaking, but those are actually actual from rallies in Havana at the time. So very interesting, and it reminds me of how the realism of Torn Curtain, that Alfred Hitchcock wanted to, make a realistic spy thriller, and we've just come a long way since those black and white spy thrillers Alfred Hitchcock made in England, where we knew we had bad guys that were members of a spy ring, but we never even knew what country they came from, let alone what conflict we were up against. So made those movies timeless. It didn't make Torn Curtain timeless. It made it dated. We'll see what happens with this one, but it made for very, very interesting reading in 1967 because we were all still very afraid of the threat of nuclear war and the Soviets. So, and there's plenty of Cold War movies to come. I mean, there's plenty of them in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and 90s, and a lot of James Bond movies are Cold War thrillers if you think about it. No Way Out, which is one of her favorite movies, is a great Cold War thriller. War Games is a great Cold War. 3 Days of the Condor is a great Cold War thriller. So anyways, there's tons of them. How will this film fare, with Leon Uris? Well, Leon Uris, the author of Topaz, ends up turning in a script that Alfred Hitchcock deemed unshootable, and he rejected it. And boy, that's not good. Does that sound familiar? Does that ever have a happy ending? And ultimately, Hitchcock brought in his own guy to rewrite the script completely at the last minute. He brings in his friend Samuel Taylor. We remember that name because Samuel Taylor wrote Vertigo, also at the last minute. And boy, I mentioned last minute with Topaz, they were, Samuel Taylor would write pages that they would be shooting hours later, and we have enough experience with Alfred Hitchcock movies that doesn't bode well. But, you know, Alfred Hitchcock was good friends with Sam Taylor, and Samuel Taylor wrote a great script in Vertigo, so we're certainly optimistic. Vertigo was a hell of a script, so... Well, who's in this thing? Well, I mentioned there weren't big names, and what we have here is a relatively unknown bunch of actors, which is what Hitchcock wanted. Although John Forsythe, who's in it, we all know because he was one of the stars in The Trouble with Harry. He, of course, became famous later for his role in Dynasty when he was a little older, and of course he's the voice of Charlie in Charlie's Angels, although you never see his face. So also he plays a CIA agent in tonight's movie. Also in the movie is an actor by the name of Frederick Stafford. He plays the French CIA agent, the French government agent. He's kind of an unknown Austrian actor. His Hollywood career never took off, but he's in this one. He's great, Frederick Stafford. You will probably recognize the Cuban representative in this movie. He plays a high-up Cuban military official named Rico Parra. And that's John Vernon. And John Vernon, John Vernon was in a million TV... If there was a TV show in the 70s, he was on it at least once. And he's most famous for being in Dirty Harry. He was the by-the-book mayor that's always yelling at Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry. But to me, he's best known as the Dean Wormer in Animal House, which I've seen a million times. So good. You know, we don't have the members of the Hitchcock production dream team that we sure got used to there for a spell of 10 or 15 movies, but we do have Edith Head. She's designing the costumes on this one, and all the fancy locations we go to in tonight's movie, a lot of which were shot on location. The music in tonight's movie is done by Maurice Jarre, who was a big name composer at this point. He'd already scored such big films as Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago. He does a whole bunch of movies throughout his career, and he does a bunch of movies in the 80s that, including No Way Out, that have that synthesizer. You know, it makes those 80s movies really dated to me, but makes them 80s movies. But anyways, he does the music for tonight's Topaz. So now, interesting note, the editing is not done by George Tomasini because he, of course, passed away after Marnie. That was Hitchcock's favorite editor and good friend. But we do have an editor by the name of William Ziegler. And this is the third picture that William Ziegler will ultimately direct for Alfred Hitchcock, the other two being Strangers on a Train and Rope. So that's kind of fun. And we'll talk more about the editing after the movie. So good. There is a cameo to look for, and be sharp because you got to be looking. If there's a crowd of people, look for them. But I don't want to give it away. And I suggest that you watch this movie with subtitles because there's a lot going on, and Pavel can't wait to watch it. So let's go. Let's watch this movie. This movie from 1969, Alfred Hitchcock's Topaz. Let's watch.